Hey everyone, this is Laggy. I am back with another video, this time on strong early game unit combinations and items that you might want to slam to stay healthy in the early game for the Hyperroll game mode. Currently I am rank 5 on the NA ladder, and these are my findings in the past week of the set 5 release. Most of the combinations I am covering today will consist of 2 to 3 units and are definitely things you want to roll for during stage 2 and 3 of Hyperroll. So starting off, we have the Aatrox Callista pairing. These two are Legionnaires, which gives them a lot of early game sustain and attack speed. One particularly strong reason that this comp is good is because Aatrox is a drain tank, while Callista provides a lot of much needed DPS in the early game. Aatrox generally holds a lot of tank items, but you can give him AD items as well. Callista works very well with attack speed and AD items. Some items you might want to slam for these. Aatrox works exceptionally well with things that give him a lot of health, allowing him to drain tank for longer periods of time. Callista works best with some AD items, Deathblade, BT, giving her some sustain, and Guinsoo's, which allows her to ramp up extremely fast in these long extended early game fights. To position Aatrox and Callista, you want to make sure that Callista is in the little corner. Aatrox can be further up depending on how many assassins there are, but what you want to make sure is that if you have another tank unit, you want to split aggro between Aatrox and the other tank unit so Aatrox doesn't get full aggro. This is because if Aatrox is only targeted by one unit, he can continuously drain tank without worrying about being bursted. Moving on, we have Vladimir and Lissandra. These two provide the Renewer trait, which allows them to gain % max health and mana per second. The only issue is that Renewers is countered by Sunfire and Morellos. A really strong item that you can slam on Vladimir is Warmogs, because by increasing his max health, he gets increased healing from Renewer, making him an extremely powerful tank. Not only that, giving him a Bramble allows him to get much needed defenses. For Lissandra, she works exceptionally well with items like Blue Buff and Jeweled Gauntlet, which you can also move to a stronger 4-cost unit like Vel'Koz or Karma. In the early game, these two are very strong. If a lot of people are clumping their units, usually because of assassins, Lissandra ult will hit all the units. Lissandra ult reduces AD, which gives you a much needed debuff in the early game. Positioning for Vladimir is very similar to Aatrox, that you don't want him to be solo targeted, thus allowing him to drain tank. A less powerful combination is the Gragas and Kha'Zix pairing. Gragas works exceptionally well with items that give him health and tank items. Kha'Zix is a very position-reliant unit. What this means is that you need to scout the whole lobby to gain maximum value on Kha'Zix. Kha'Zix is stronger in lobbies where people don't actually position for you. So in lobbies where everyone is clumping their units, generally happens a lot more in higher elo, Kha'Zix is not as effective because he won't be able to get that isolated damage. But if people are scattering their units, Kha'Zix can basically be a free unit kill and win you the early game. Another pairing that is particularly decent, not as strong as some of the earlier comps, is two knights. So two of the early game knights you can get are Leona and Poppy. And having two knights is generally pretty good as long as you have a good damage unit that can accompany them. Having knights is actually pretty effective. If there are a lot of static shiv builders in the lobby, knights will be really strong against that because it prevents small amounts of tick damage. Therefore, it counters any sort of DOT, especially if people have an early brand. However, it doesn't counter Morellos because it is true damage. Another decent two pairing is two brawlers. Gragas and Warwick are the two early game brawlers that you're likely to 2-star. Although they have no synergies with each other other than brawler, you can definitely slot in a third unit that fits one of the synergies like Kha'Zix, or just having a good DPS backline like a Ranger with a Guinsoo. Now moving on, we have some 3-unit combos that you might encounter. The Hellion Opener, which is usually Poppy, Ziggs, Kled, occasionally Cannon. This is a very popular start, mainly because it's so strong. Ziggs has one of the highest base attack speeds in the game. Therefore, slamming static shiv on Ziggs is generally something people do. He also works well with something like Guinsoo for that early game ramp damage. Since this is one of the most popular openers, you're very likely to face this and also contest with other players. Other than that, it's very strong and there isn't too much positioning wise you can do for it. Now, another possible drop you might get is the Redeemed. So Redeemed, usually you will get Aatrox and Leona, and your third Redeemed might be Varus or Syndra. This is also a fairly decent early game starter, not as strong as some of the other ones. This comp is a bit weaker in my experience, but it transitions very well into the mid game. The last 3 unit combination that I've found is pretty good is skirmishers. If you manage to get 2 2-cost skirmishers with an Udyr 2, it's pretty strong early game combo, mainly because of the shield and the fact skirmishers are generally pretty good units. On Kennen, since he stuns the whole board, you can throw Morellos on him. Udyr is a very strong unit. He does a lot of damage, and he's also generally tanky, giving him Bloodthirster and Guinsoo. If you can slam either of those, it will make him your primary damage dealer. He's also a great item holder for a lot of late game AD champions. Last of all, I'm going to go over some strong standalone individual units. So basically, if you get a 2-star of these units early and you have like an extra slot, it's a good idea to throw them in. So as I mentioned earlier, Udyr is a very powerful unit. You don't really need any synergies. He doesn't really have any good synergies other than Skirmisher because Draconic is basically a fake trait. As mentioned earlier, Udyr works very well with BT and Guinsoo. BT giving him that early game sustain and Guinsoo allowing him to ramp up. In this image, I have him shown with 2 knights, very flexible with the other units you can have. Having 2 knights with Udyr makes him very tanky and allows him to ramp up. Again, Kha'Zix, great unit to splash in. Just make sure you position. If you position well, you'll win the early game fight, and it also takes advantage of those who position poorly. Again, Ziggs, even if you don't have Hellion, he is still a solid backline unit. Ziggs is very flexible. You can pretty much slam anything on him as long as it's damage. In this image, I show Brand with Abomination start. Occasionally, if you're really lucky and you get a Nunu, you might be able to run triple A bomb. Usually, that won't be the case, but Brand is still a very solid unit, especially if you give him blue buff, because he'll basically cast every second, therefore burning the whole enemy team. Since early game is mostly about extended trades, you get full value from his burn. Great items to slam on Brand include Jeweled Gauntlet, Gunblade. If you feel like he might get whittled down by static shiv damage, basically you can transfer his items to Vel'Koz or Karma later. Another great unit that I've had a lot of success with if you get 2-star early is Sejuani. She's super tanky and actually deals a lot of damage, especially if you get a Kled in the early game. Having that 2 Cavalier is very strong, especially paired with some good DPS. In this image, I have a pretty good 4-unit combo with an early game Yasuo drop with Callista. Very solid stage 4 comp. Another great unit to sort of throw in is Thresh, especially if you have another knight unit. It gives you the knight synergy, and not only that, Thresh basically removes a backline DPS for a good multiple seconds and will also drag them within range of your front line. Very underrated. Thresh is very strong and also punishes poor positioning, especially if somebody's cornering their carries. It's also very hard to play around in the early game since you have so few units. Now, I mentioned earlier Syndra was a great unit to have in a redeem comp. She is just a very strong unit in general because the CC she provides by throwing a unit in the backline is humongous, especially if they're a melee ranged unit, because now they have to walk all the way back to get back in the fight. Not only that, she counters assassins completely. So Kha'Zix jumping in the backline gets thrown all the way back to their backline. She might also be able to help isolate units. So say they clump a lot of their frontline units, she throws one of them back. Now your Kha'Zix gets free isolate damage if he's stuck on a frontliner. She's also a great item holder for Vel'Koz. Also, if you give Syndra enough damage, she can actually kill the backliners for you, which is very convenient because usually backliners aren't as protected or they don't have much sustain in the early game. Yasuo is one of the best 3-star early drops, especially if you get it from an orb, because it does a lot of damage and he ramps up through the fight. He is very squishy, so you want to make sure he doesn't take any aggro by usually surrounding him with other frontliners. Some good items you can slam on him are the ones I've shown below: Jeweled Gauntlet, Gunblade for sustain, and Blue Buff for more cast. These items are also very transferable on to say Karma or Vel'Koz. Great unit to splash in, especially if you don't have a reliable DPS, if you have like a 2 Brawler or 2 Knight starter. The last notable 3-cost that I've felt was pretty strong is Pantheon. He is surprisingly tanky and also applies grievous wounds. If there are a lot of healing based comps and you don't have a Morellos, Pantheon might be a good splash unit. He also doesn't need any synergies to function. In this picture I put redemption on him. Since he's so tanky, it allows him to get more redemption procs and get more value. Now going over some of the best early game items to slam. You might have noticed in some of the images, a lot of units have Rageblade. The reason Rageblade is so good in the early game is because of the extended fights, allowing a DPS unit to ramp up significantly and basically win the fight. Not only that, Rageblade is also transferable to many 4-cost carries like Draven, Aphelios, and also to a lesser extent Jax. Another great early game slam is Warmogs. This is because it basically more than doubles a unit's health in the early game, as well as being transferable to lots of late game frontliners such as God Kings or Ivern, Mordekaiser. It also has great synergy with Dawn and Nightbringer, mainly because both of those traits scale off of max health. Also, you might have noticed that I've put a lot of redemptions. Redemption is also an item I really like. This is because the new redemption for set 5 is insanely good for extended fights and beefy frontliners. If you have a brawler frontline, 4 brawlers, redemption will give you so much healing, you're pretty much unkillable. So this also goes for other beefy frontliners like knights or cavaliers. I think redemption is just a great item to have, especially if you have a lot of frontliners. Another decent item you can slam in the early game, it's Thief's Gloves. This is because it basically gives you an extra item component. Very preferable that you place Thief Gloves on your frontliners or a melee DPS to give them more survivability and damage. Sometimes an early game Thief's Gloves will roll you something really good, like a Warmog, which can also win you the fight. Now, if you're running a comp that only has a solo frontliner in the early game, such as Leona or maybe Gragas, slamming a Gargoyle Stoneblade or a Shadow Gargoyles is something that can get you a lot of value, mainly because that Shadow Gargoyles will heal you a bunch, pretty powerful in the early game, and Gargoyles just gives you a bunch of armor and MR. Both of these are pretty good. As long as you stick to a solo frontliner, the effectiveness decreases as you have more frontliners. Generally, it's a good item to also slam in the early game. Last of all, Sunfire and Morellos. This is more situational, but it's great for heal-heavy lobbies, or if you have a good Morellos user. Say Kennen, because Kennen can basically apply Morellos to the whole team in the early game. So overall, these are some of the item slams and unit combinations that I usually prefer to play in the early game. Let me know what you guys think. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.